Hi, everybody. Brianna here with NurseDeck. As you know, NurseDeck is a collaborative social space for nurses, built by nurses, where we aim to share resources, guides, camaraderie, humor, work-life sanity savers for nurses across all walks of life. We are doing our interview series here, and today I am joined by Dr. Carey Clark. Dr. Clark is a professor of nursing in the Medical Cannabis Certificate Program at Pacific College of Health and Science. She has an extensive background across many different specialties and disciplines, med-surg, psych, pediatrics, hospice, home health, parish nurse settings, and she is the immediate past president of the American Cannabis Nurses Association, and has also written a textbook on the subject. So we're definitely going to dive into that area, which I'm very excited about. But welcome, Dr. Clark. Thank you for giving us your time this morning.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Yeah. I'm excited to be here and talk about some of my favorite subjects.
Hey. Tell us how you got your start in nursing.
Boy, so my mother was a nurse.
Okay.
She always knew she wanted to be a nurse. Like, she started working in the skilled, I guess they called them nursing homes back in the day. When she was in high school as like a nurse's aide, went right to school and got her bachelor's and master's degree, worked in a variety of different settings, including as a nurse educator. And when I was 16 or 17 and looking at schools, she said, "You should be a nurse." And I said, "Not a chance in heck, Mom." My perception, even though I'd seen my mother in these really professional roles in nursing, sorry, that's my cat. He's
okay. I have one here that might float around.
Yes. So I'd seen her in all these really professional settings, and as a leader, I still thought of nurses as sort of the handmaiden, I should say, of the doctors, and that they really kind of just took care of patients' physical needs. So I didn't really have a good understanding of what nurses did. I went to school and started off as a chemistry major, decided that wasn't for me. And I got a degree in foods and nutrition. I worked as what we would now call a health coach, I think.
Okay.
Back then, I called myself an educator with moderately to morbidly obese patients, and had an opportunity to go back to school and really felt like called to nursing. So you can imagine my mother was absolutely thrilled.
Yeah.
But what I was really happy about was that I could take sort of my skills as a coach and an educator and use them at the bedside and really build my skills around, of course, technical skills, but being really caring and compassionate at the bedside. So when I got out, I worked med-surg and psych for a few years and then became a hospice nurse. And I still to this day feel like in my heart, even though mostly what I do right now is education, is that I'm a hospice nurse, and I hope to someday actually return to that bedside. So
yeah, interesting. I followed a similar trajectory. A lot of what you were saying is very relatable to me personally, with family and medicine trying to push me that way. And I didn't really see the writing on the wall. I had to, do my own thing and then decide. I think it was like I was cramming for, I forget what class it was, but I remember learning about the Krebs cycle and just being like, no, I cannot do this. I'm too tired. I'm going to do something different. My family was like, yeah, we're just waiting for you to arrive at this conclusion.
Exactly.
So you mentioned hospice care, but I see you have an extensive education background for yourself. And we always love to see nurses that have gone on to higher education and advanced degrees. How did you find your inspiration or motivation to do that? And in growing as an educator, how do you continue to grow and develop as a leader in the educational role?
Yeah, so I had the bachelor's degree in foods and nutrition. And after I finished my associate degree, I decided, I thought that I should be able to get right into a master's degree since I had a bachelor's in a related field. and applied to a couple programs, and they all said, yeah, you can do that, but you've got to take like 24 units of bachelor's level nursing classes. I was like, why would I do that? I'll just get a second bachelor's in nursing. So
Mm.
I did that. And at that time, I started teaching. So I really feel like my impetus for going on to get higher degrees of education was that I did want to be an educator.
Mhm.
My experience with working with moderately to morbidly obese patients
Mm.
really, I think, motivated me as well, because I felt like, even though I wasn't a holistic nurse yet, I felt like I had a more holistic
Yeah.
approach, and prevention was really important to me. And I wanted to be able to do nursing education a little bit differently.
Mm.
So I started teaching a couple years after I became a nurse. I was finishing up that second bachelor's degree. I started teaching with LVN students in the clinical setting, and then got a full-time job with RN students. Finished up my in an associate. Actually, it was the associate degree program where I had gotten my associate degree.
Oh, funny.
So that was kind of interesting because it's really it's really interesting to change your role in a
Mm.
setting from where you were a student. Everybody remembers you being a student.
Yeah.
A few years later, you have some experience and some education. You come back as a teacher. So for a little while, that was kind of wrapping my mind around that these people that were my educators were now my colleagues.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, and while I was getting my master's degree, halfway through the program, so this was back in the day, this was like the year 2000,
Mhm.
the faculty asked for a student representative to serve on this technology committee
Mm.
because they wanted to move the program online.
Okay. Wow, in the 2000s, that's ahead of
Yeah,
their time.
it was definitely, and I was like, oh, I was so excited. The teacher announced this in class, and I like ran up on break, like nobody else want to do this, only I, me. And of course, nobody else wanted to do it. So I got to do it, and sitting around the table with these PhD prepared professors that I really admired, and I could say kind of wanted to be like, I started to
Mhm.
figure out, like, I could do that. I could stay
Yeah.
in school and get my doctorate degree too.
Right.
Lo and behold, the program did go fully online for my last year of my master's
Ah.
program. I was actually shocked that they got it together so quickly. Even though I was the student representative, I should have seen it coming. I didn't
Right.
see it coming. Um, and the first couple weeks were really challenging, moving into a new modality, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I spent a lot of time those first couple weeks, and I was teaching full time and
Mm.
doing hospice per diem. So it was a lot.
Yeah.
I did not have children yet, so that really helped. But I absolutely fell in love with
Mm.
online teaching and, well, learning, I guess, more so than teaching at that point.
Yeah.
Um, and just thought it was the coolest thing that we weren't just kind of sitting around in a classroom
Right.
and shooting the baloney, right? We were actually supporting our ideas and concepts with the body of evidence.
Mhm.
Um, and I found that to be a really much more rich experience.
Mm.
When I was finishing up my master's degree, we had to do a comprehensive written exam/paper, and we were encouraged to go out and have other graduates read it. So I found a graduate from the program and got her to read it. She had just finished her PhD, and I was looking at EdD programs and PhD programs and not sure what I wanted to do. And she said, well, this is where I went to school. And she pulled up the school, the California Institute of Integral Studies. She said it is WASC accredited, and she studied something called transformative learning and change. And I went,
Mm.
it was like one of those lightning bolt moments, like,
Yeah.
oh, that's what I want to do.
Right.
I
Yeah, it
went,
exists.
yeah. So I went home and called the school. They said, well, it's too bad that we've closed applications for the semester. And I was like pretty bummed. She said, do you think, though, that in a week you could have, so I'm trying to finish up my master's degree. And she said, do you think you could have a 10-page personal bio and a 10-page
Wow.
essay on Hari Das Shad Hurry versus Albert North Whitehead's philosophies. I had no idea who these people were. I was like, yeah, I could do that.
Yeah.
So I did get into the program. It was an amazing experience, a lot of philosophy and Eastern thought. I got to take some great electives like Death and Dying, but it was taught by a Buddhist nun.
Mm,
And we spent it was like a weekend retreat, and most of it was in silence. And
wow.
then we did an independent project, and we got credit for doing that. So that's kind of an example of
Yeah.
some of
Very
the
cool.
classes I got to take. But I also got to go and study with Dr. Jean Watson,
Oh, wow.
who, for those that don't know, developed the theory of human caring.
Yep.
I just emailed her when I was doing my master's degree. One of my professors encouraged me to email her, and within an hour, she got back to me. I was like,
Wow.
"What? Here's this
Yeah.
famous nurse leader." Um,
I know. You just jumped out of my textbook at me and I'm
yeah.
emailing you.
And
Wow.
so I got to go, and at that time, she taught a class with graduate students. It was a week-long seminar type of class. You stayed there in Boulder. It was at Naropa University, which is
Yeah.
um,
I did my undergrad at Boulder, so I know
oh,
Naropa
okay.
well.
So you know Boulder well.
Yes.
Naropa's like also an Eastern thought type
Yep.
of school. Um, and so amazing to be on that little campus and in Boulder. And she had us over to her house for dinner one night. But we sat in what she called Sacred Circle for that week and shared and did different modalities, created our own little sacred circle within that.
Mm.
She only talked about her theory for like maybe an hour, and we maybe had an hour discussion out of like the 35, 40 hours that we spent
Right.
during that week. But it really motivated me that I want to do something different in nursing
Yeah.
education. And so my dissertation focused on her theory and placing it alongside other philosophies to kind of
Mhm.
expand and explicate it. And what I walked away from that I think is so important, especially now, I think it's only gotten more important with the pandemic and all the suffering of nurses and the changes in our professional environments, is that we've got to be taking care of ourselves.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely.
and that is so important. I also just recently, it's been peer reviewed and is in the editing stages. I did some research with nursing students and found that nursing students, a number of like 12 or 1300, and found that nursing students have a higher number of adverse childhood experiences.
Mm.
So we
Mhm.
come to the profession with more trauma than the general public.
Huh.
Um, my findings showed a lot more trauma.
Wow. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So there's
Huh.
another theory called nurse's wounded healer.
Yeah. Wow.
So because we've had these experiences, we really get drawn to the healing arts.
Yeah.
And we need to be on our own healing path. If we're going to have sustainable, caring, healing nursing practices, we've
Yeah.
got to be healing ourselves.
Right.
And that was kind of the big. Jean says that in her theory, but it just became so much more meaningful like 400 pages later.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Yes.
Wow, that's really incredible. It resonates so much right now, from what nurses are going through, and I think that, I think we connect in the valleys of life just naturally.
Mm.
So to hear that nurses come from traumatic backgrounds, it makes a lot of sense. That really feels right, correct to me.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you a good caregiver, because who else could really understand what you're going through in a moments of suffering as someone else who's suffered, also.
Well, and our environments are so stressful, right? There's actually, a lot of science around things like mirror neurons. So
Yeah,
if we show up at the patient's bedside and we are stressed out, they're already stressed out. We're just
right.
going to like amplify each other's
Exactly.
stress,
Right.
right? If we show up at the bedside and we can be more calm and relaxed,
Right.
and help them as well to be more calm and relaxed, we're all gonna like
Right.
feel better, do better, heal better. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, so there's a lot of great evidence to show that that's what we want to be doing, is taking care of ourselves. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I've never really heard it put in a framework like that before of because I think nurses so easily will put themselves out to go and do things on behalf of their patients. Of
yes,
course, putting themselves at the bottom of the list, but if you reframe self-care as actually being beneficial to your patients in terms of
yes.
like the neuroscience involved, that's so fascinating. Um,
I do have an article out there that people can find on the web. Just type in my name and this word psychoneuroimmunology,
okay.
and nurses or nursing.
Okay.
And it will show up. It's a free article, open access, and it
Awesome.
talks about the real, stress response, what it means for nursing, and why we need to take care of ourselves. And it's really, an evidence-based approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's awesome.
so I think people will find that really helpful.
Absolutely. Talk to us about gentle leadership, what
Mm.
that means, what your thoughts are on that.
So I'm hearing this so much more now than even just a few years ago. I think people really don't understand in our culture what gentle leadership is. And actually, I think it still is sort of evolving as a concept and an idea.
Mhm.
When I was president of American Cannabis Nurses Association, a couple of times people said to me, "Oh, you're such a gentle leader." Um, and sometimes that can be said in a way that's almost derogatory instead
Right, right.
of positive, right?
Yep.
So for me, though, what gentle leadership means is, firstly, we're gentle and compassionate with ourselves,
Mm,
because being a leader is so stressful to begin with, right?
mhm.
And next, that we really lead by being a role model, and a mentor, and that
Mhm.
we create opportunities for people, and we gently guide them to where they need to be. I love this idea too of, I've heard this idea a lot too, of like the hand up, right? So
Right.
flattening sort of those hierarchies they exist out in the natural world, they exist in our organizations, but kind of bringing people up with you.
Yes.
um, and maybe sometimes they're going to go up too, right?
Right.
Maybe even above you. um, and that's amazing.
Right. Yeah.
So, but I do think it starts with managing our own stress, being gentle and compassionate with ourselves, um, recognizing those around us that need care too, and really creating sort of these caring, healing, organizational environments, so people feel supported in doing their work, and
Mhm.
all back to that idea of our stress and our stress response, and
Yeah.
really trying to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. That's amazing. I think with people that have been lucky enough to have mentors like that are gonna picture someone who you're describing right now, um, that really are it reminds me of the word attraction. Leaders like that, I think,
Right.
attract people to them. And so you end up, I don't want to say following them, but emulating them and watching how they are in the world rather than being instructed, on how
Right.
to be. Um, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk
Sure.
about cannabis nursing, which is
Yay.
a relatively new field. I know you have a ton of expertise in this area, and we had a lot of feedback on the article that we recently put out about it. So I know people are super curious about it. You've written a textbook, you've taught in this area, designed curriculum. Can you talk a little bit about all of that?
Yes, yes. So it's one of my favorite topics. Um, so uh, where do I start with that? Okay, so I'm married to a musician, so I know about cannabis from the recreational perspective,
Hmm.
um, and I used cannabis recreationally when I was in college, my first degree, but stopped using it when I got out because I was having side effects from it, and then was not using it as a nurse. But I was living in California, and I did vote for medical cannabis legalization back in
Hmm.
the 1990s. And that was an amazing thing that happened.
Hmm. Was
And
California the first state to legalize it?
there's some
Medically?
debate about whether it was California or New Mexico, but
Okay,
California was the first state to legalize it on sort of a broad perspective.
gotcha.
Um, so So California legalized it. When I was a hospice nurse there, though, it was kind of like our policies were don't ask, don't tell, don't talk about it. If you see it, just ask patients to put it away. I mean, it was medically legal. I do still to this day do not understand why we weren't saying, would you like to look into using cannabis to help palliate your symptoms? Instead, it was, of course, all about all the other meds. And often I would see patients that would die, and the last part of their life was really low quality of life, right? Because they were so, I don't want to say over medicated, but medicated to the point of relief, but that also left them unable to communicate and have much quality of life, right? So we left California. We were living in Western Sonoma County. That's one of the leading cannabis growing areas in the state of California. So it was everywhere. It was just part of the culture. Come October, the whole neighborhood would smell of terpenes, which are the essential oils that give cannabis its unique smell. And you couldn't escape it. And moved to Maine, which at the time had the second highest per capita cannabis use in the United States. And I didn't see it anywhere. I didn't smell it. I didn't see it. It was so odd to me. There were maybe 6 dispensaries in the whole state, but even those were pretty well hidden. And I didn't think that much about it. And then I had I'm a holistic nurse, advanced holistic nurse board certified. And I had an AHNA student faculty chapter on my campus. I was teaching at University of Maine at Augusta. Where I developed a holistic integral curriculum. I no longer teach there. Well, actually, I'm going back there to teach some part-time classes, so that will be fun. But anyway, they brought this physician in to not talk about medical cannabis, but to talk about caring and healing and presence at the bedside. And he was amazing. And afterwards, he said, well, what I do is I recommend medical cannabis to patients that can come back and talk about that. I said, that would be fascinating. He came back. His name is Dr. Dustin Sulak. He has a website called healer.com, Healer. Great resources there. And I learned all about this thing in the body called the endocannabinoid system. So to put it kind of shortly, is our bodies make our own endocannabinoids, which are cannabis-like substances. There's a whole system in the body called the endocannabinoid system. It's important for helping us to maintain homeostasis. When we don't make enough of those, we can become ill or have other health issues. And that's why people may need to supplement with cannabis, which interacts directly with the endocannabinoid system. For me, when I learned about that, it was like the big light bulb. I was so excited and so thrilled to know how it worked in the body. And it is kind of like, how can it work for nausea? How can it work for Parkinson's? How can it help stop seizures? Like, it doesn't make sense. It sounds like snake oil. Understand the physiological system that it interacts with. So we had him come back a couple times, and then I also had him come I taught a class called, I'm trying to remember what it specifically was called. I guess it doesn't really matter, but it was for nurses it was thanatology for nurses. So death and dying at the end of life for death and dying, of course, is at the end of life. So it was called thanatology for nurses. And he was specifically talking about cannabis, and he's like, you really seem to like this topic a lot. I was like, yes, I do. He said, there's an organization called American Cannabis Nurses Association. So you should go home and join it. I was like, what are you talking about? So ACNA is a 501c3 not-for-profit nursing organization. It's been around for about 11 or 12 years now. When I started, there were just a couple hundred members. And when I started, I connected with the president then. Her name's Eileen Konechny. She actually has a great book out there called Healing with CBD. If you're curious about the CBD stuff. And she was like, I want you to do something in the organization. What do you want to do? I said, well, I'm really interested in research and education. So I started the Research and Education Committee. We put out a white paper on how all nurses need to be educated in this area. And she then asked me to run for president. And And I really had to think about it, and I had to talk with my family. I knew it was going to be a big commitment.
Right.
The organization was growing really quickly. We got a management organizational group. And around that time as well, I started advocating for adult use cannabis here in Maine, because I really felt that there were lots of people that were not able to access cannabis that could benefit. And I also felt like this is a pathway for us, right? For us to begin to kind of free the plant and move out of this prohibition era.
Right.
I did get in trouble at work for doing that. I wrote a letter. I was on a TV commercial, and then I wrote a letter because it was a referendum that was going to be voted for by the people, and it went out to 10,000 healthcare providers in the state of Maine. And some of those healthcare providers, even though it was quite a long letter, I think it was 2 pages, and I explained why I supported it and why they may want to consider supporting it, contacted the school, talked to my president, felt I should be fired.
Oh, boy.
Colleagues got upset with me, felt it looked bad for the university. Luckily, I had just been tenured.
I welcome your feedback.
Yes. So, I mean, they took it to the lawyers and everything. They didn't know what to do with me other than just say,
what year are we talking about here?
We are talking about 2016.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot has happened in just the 5 years or 7 years, 6 years since then. Yeah.
Yeah. So it did pass in Maine, but just barely by like 2,000 votes.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And there was a process to recount the votes, and then it took 4 years to operationalize. Like when Nevada went adult use legal, they did it in 6 months or something.
Right.
So I did run for president, and I was president of ACNA. One of my first goals was to develop the scope and standards of cannabis care nursing. I did that. Just, it takes a lot to run a nursing organization.
I'm sure.
And a lot of stuff that people don't see in the behind scenes. But I would spend anywhere from 10 to 20 hours a week on top of my full-time job working on that. Oncology Nursing Society invited me to speak at Congress in 2017, which was an amazing experience. And then they sent me out to a bunch of other sort of regional conferences. And then I started just getting requests from kind of more local or state Oncology Nursing Society and other conferences. So up until the pandemic started, I was going out to talk to nurses about this once or twice a month.
Yeah. Wow.
And
was it mostly with like oncology or palliative care?
Mostly, so some palliative care. I did speak at NHPCO in which is National Hospice Palliative Care Organization, I think, which is a mix. So that's nurses, social workers, I think some doctors. It was a breakout session, so it wasn't a primary session, and it was still, I probably had 200 people in there.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, people want to know about this.
Yes, they do. And also some holistic nursing groups. I'm still doing quite a number of webinars, and we're starting to kind of see our way back into the more face-to-face kinds of conferences and that kind of thing. So that's pretty exciting. I wrote an article for CJON, the Clinical Journal of Oncology Nursing, that basically does a real basic explanation of the endocannabinoid system and what the nurse's role is. And then the other great thing I did as president, it was one of my goals, so I think it was a great thing, was we had our first really inaugural standalone ACNA sponsored conference in 2019 in New Orleans. We had over 200 nurses, and it was just an amazing time to come together. And then we had a virtual one, and now I'm the immediate past president, so I'm just a regular member like everybody else in ACNA. But we just had our third one in New Mexico, and we will have another one next year. So if people are interested in that, you'll find more information at our website. Somewhere along the way, too, we became members of the Nursing Organization Alliance. What that is about 50 or 60 different nursing organizations. And and they provide great training around leadership and how to be in an organization, how to serve on a board, and great support across organizations. As you can imagine, cannabis crosses like every nursing specialty.
Right.
So when we go to these NOAA types of conferences, everyone wants to talk to us because it impacts every area in nursing. And then, of course, the textbook, right? So I was actually at a NOAA conference in probably 2018, and started with one of my colleagues talking to one of the publishing groups there. And so we have this textbook, and it's published by Wolters-Kuhlwer, which is a legit academic publisher. And the book is around 300 something pages. It has 9 chapters. It talks about the history of cannabis and how we got into the Prohibition era and how we're moving into what I call a post-Prohibition era, or an era of cannabis regulation.
Yeah.
And then there's a chapter on the endocannabinoid system. There's a chapter, and so those were written by some of my colleagues. And then I co-wrote a chapter on the pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacodynamics. I co-wrote a chapter on the evidence and research. There's a chapter on CBD. I wrote a chapter on the nurse's role. The current president of ACNA, Eloise Thiessen, wrote the chapter on the advanced practice nurse's role. And then there's a chapter on ethics and advocacy.
Wow.
Yeah. So
sounds very thorough. I think those are most of the areas people always, question about it,
Right. So it's a great little tool.
Yeah.
We also just did some research that I'm hoping by the end of the month we'll submit it for peer review, but we did a survey with also over 1,000 nursing students to see if they're getting education around medical cannabis.
Yeah.
Because in 2018, the National Council of State Boards of Nursing said you've got to be educating nurses across all levels of nursing education about medical cannabis.
Yeah.
And they defined 6 essential areas that nurses need to know about. Those are covered in the textbook. And it's not happening. So that's the quick summary of the research, is that it's not happening.
Yeah.
The good news is that students recognize that they need this information.
Right.
What we're hearing from them, what faculty are saying is like, one, they still think that there's not enough research about cannabis. It's the most researched plant.
Right. I read something like that the other day.
Yeah. Over 30,000 articles about it. It's fairly safe. It can have side and adverse effects, but nothing like about like the side or adverse effects of opiates or alcohol, but we still teach about those.
Right.
That when faculty do teach about it, they teach about it from a substance abuse perspective and not from a therapeutic perspective.
Right.
And that students really wanted this knowledge. And even if they're in a state where it's not, quote, legal or medically allowed, although most states have some kind of medical law at this point, except for I think 2. And it's like the faculty don't even recognize that. They don't recognize that students are also living in other states but going to school in this state, or likely to become travelers at this point. That's absolutely exploding. And that, for me right now, it's really it's like NCSBN called it. That we need to be doing this. Patients are using it. We are actually ethically obligated to support patients in their autonomy to choose this. There's social justice issues going on around it. And, there's a real true ethical obligation for us to learn about this, to be able to support patients to use it safe and effectively. It's not going away.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. And to have it something that's, streamlined within our scope of practice, so that all nurses are learning the same thing about it, and not just whatever you happen to Google because your patient mentioned it offhand to you,
Right. And that's what our survey showed too, is that is how nursing students are learning about it. They're Googling it. They might read some research articles on it, which they probably don't even know how to analyze. Because we don't teach people how to do that very well until they get to the graduate level. And they're learning from patients, which is good. I strongly believe in a patient-informed practice, a patient evidence-guided. I've heard a bunch of different terms lately, but that we learn from our patients. But there was a survey that was done with oncology patients in Washington State, which is an adult use and medical cannabis use. And they surveyed 900 patients, and over 200 patients of those 900 surveyed had used medical cannabis recently. And they wanted to get their information from their healthcare provider. 85% said, I want to hear about this from nurses, doctors, oncologists. And only 15% ever got any information at all from their healthcare providers. So, it's no longer to just say, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge gap. Those are big, big numbers. You mentioned a few times the role of the nurse, the role of the nurse. I know it's difficult to boil it down into a few talking points, but if you could synopsize what the role of the nurse is with cannabis.
Sure. So, well, there's kind of like the general role of the nurse and what you would need to do. And then there's a cannabis nurse role that's more specific. So with the general role of the nurse, you're going to, just apply the nursing process, right? So during assessment, you'll be asking them about any prior or current cannabis use, if they've explored perhaps using cannabis medicinally for their condition. You would also, as you go into this process, need to be aware of your state laws and federal laws and regulations, which NCSBN also says that you need to do. I don't want to leave that out. So just assessing, and try not to approach it the same way that we do with medicines that are very damaging. I wouldn't even say medicines, substances that are very damaging, like nicotine and other narcotics and that kind of thing. So maybe including it in your assessment along with herbal medications that a patient might use, right? To kind of change that stigma that is the reefer madness that is carrying over. And then, starting to document these things, get them in our charting. And intervention, nursing diagnosis could be almost anything from spiritual distress, which we haven't really talked about that, but cannabis is a plant entheogen. So it's one of the few medicines that we have that can help support people's spiritual healing. It does that by creating sort of a space for healing. A spaciousness, I think, is a way to describe it. Better understanding of self and the connection with others. So any kind of nursing diagnosis that applies could be, altered status of nutrition, pain, all those things, activity intolerance. You can kind of start to imagine how it might help with any number of nursing diagnoses. Interventions might be educating patients how to use it safely and effectively, seeing what their baseline knowledge is, coaching them around how to get a medical recommendation in their state, those kinds of things. And then if you have the opportunity to evaluate them, you would, of course, evaluate whatever interventions that you used. And so that's something that all nurses can do. And then the cannabis care nurse is going to get more into a coaching role and support patients on how to select their medicine that's going to be best for them, how to read something that's called a certificate of analysis, which if they're getting cannabis from a dispensary, a certificate of analysis should show everything that's in the medicine, how to access medicine safely, how to use it safely. So, that's a big one, right? Because we hear these stories. So I'll tell a story of this was in the news a couple of years ago, and it was in Massachusetts when adult use just started, and these people were out on the Cape or somewhere, wanted to go out to a nice dinner, but thought they'd celebrate by starting with an edible cannabis product. We're getting ready to go to the restaurant, and we're like, oh, it's been an hour. I can't feel this at all. So they took some more. By the time they were sitting down to order, they were literally, the term used was like passed out, I would say maybe falling asleep. And the police were called, and it's kind of that typical story we hear that people don't understand that you take an edible and you should not have another edible for at
Right.
least 3 or 4 hours. And even
Yeah.
then, I would just say, just wait until the next day,
Right. Right.
because it can take such a while to digest and affect you. The
Hmm.
good news is that you can't overdose. So we do hear that a lot too. Oh, the patient, there was an overdose on cannabis. No, they used too much and they had an adverse
Right.
experience, which can be things like paranoia, feeling like you're going to die. But the good news
Yeah.
is nobody's ever died from cannabis use. It's pretty
Right.
much impossible. And there's very few cannabinoid receptors in the brainstem, so it won't stop
Mm.
anybody's breathing.
Right.
I do recommend not using alcohol and cannabis. That could be an issue
Yeah.
if someone was intoxicated and then had cannabis and it affected their nausea and vomiting type of response.
Right. Right.
Could be an issue. Um, so the cannabis care nurse, their roles, more of the coaching, the helping the patient to titrate their medicine so they can figure out what we call chemovar. We used to call them strains, but
Mm.
it's which plant medicine is going to work best for them.
Right.
um, Helping them to see if they have any side or adverse effects. We really want patients to use the least amount of cannabis possible to
Hmm.
manage their symptoms. They do not necessarily have to feel high in order
Right.
to have the benefits.
Right.
And then we also coach them to, there are things you can do to upregulate that endocannabinoid system. And it's all the things we've been talking about already. So yoga,
Hmm.
exercise, eating a diet that's rich in flavonoids, which are the colors
Hmm.
in our plant
Hmm.
products, right? So grapes and strawberries, berries have a lot of flavonoids. The cannabis plant itself has flavonoids, and those all help the endocannabinoid system to function properly.
Okay.
Balancing omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Most of us get too many omega-6 and not enough
Right.
omega-3, and we need that balance for the ECS to work properly.
Right.
Things like meditation, reducing our stress,
Hmm.
can make the endocannabinoid system function a little bit better. Losing weight if a person is obese can also put less strain on the endocannabinoid system. So the goal is to really take a holistic approach, that people are
Yeah.
changing their lifestyle, because rarely is cannabis going to be sort of enough on its own. It is
Mm.
sometimes. But again, we're back to that idea of we want people to use the least amount, that it's most
Right.
effective. We also want them to be able to take breaks from cannabis so that they
Hmm.
have other tools and can kind of reset that ECS and then come back to it and see where they're at.
Right.
Unless
Right.
they have, unless they're like a hospice patient or a seizure patient that is
Right.
helping them manage their seizures with cannabis. We want people to take regular breaks. So,
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's such a wealth of knowledge to be that's out there for the taking for people that
oh
are
yeah.
interested in it, or all nurses. I mean, it is such a amazing therapy that I feel like we're just getting the tip of the iceberg on it, in terms of practice.
We are, and I think a lot is going to change in the future once we get rid of sort of the federal prohibition and move toward federal regulation. We'll see a lot more research. We'll see a lot
Mhm.
more pharmaceutical development. It will become, cannabinoid therapeutics will become more standardized. I'm hopeful that people will still access the whole plant as a sacred entheogen and have a relationship with the plant.
Mm.
Uh, which can be healing as well.
Mhm.
But I think we'll see a lot more really kind of specialized cannabinoid therapeutics designed for specific illness or wellness issues. So,
Yeah. Fascinating. It's all so fascinating. Um, we've touched on it here and there, but can you speak directly about, you developed specifically, a holistic integral nursing program for students, and if you could talk about why holistic nursing is so important, for nurses as a framework for when they're learning. I think it's the foundation of nursing, in my opinion, and
mhm.
we always are used always are using it no matter how specialized we get in our own disciplines. But
Right.
yeah, you could talk about that.
Yeah. So that experience really stemmed from my dissertation that I talked about earlier. And I related that to Barbie Dostie has a theory of integral nursing. And what it basically says is that you've got to be practicing self-reflection and knowing yourself better in order to really be able to meet patients where they're at and create sort of caring, healing spaces. It's much more complex than that. And so it kind of aligns very well with Watson's theory as well. And actually, it aligns with Benner's theory of novice to expert, which clearly states that in order to get to expertise, you've got to be reflecting on what you're doing, right? As a nurse, we've all had those shifts where you're like, oh, like if I could go back and do this differently, but that, and so, it's that sometimes we don't want to think about that. We might push it down. Sometimes we don't want to listen to that little voice inside of us, and it can be hard work to do it, but it is really important for our growth as experts. So I was living in California and looking to move to Maine. My husband's family had a summer camp out here, and we came out quite frequently. And I started to look around and really liked Maine. Our children were quite young. They were 2 and 4 years old. It was like, I'd like them to go to school here and have some seasons and ski more. And after living in California, like 40 something years, it was a pretty exciting perspective for me. And I applied for a bunch of jobs and didn't hear anything. I thought, well, it'll happen eventually. And so that was October when I really felt called to be here in Maine. Applied for some jobs in January. And then in April, I actually was coming back from a different conference with Gene Watson. And there was a message from University of Maine at Augusta to please call them back. They wanted to interview me. So I flew out the next week, did the interview, all day long interview process. They were looking to develop an RN to bachelor's completion BSN program. And they said, you can do whatever you want. So how often does someone get the experience?
Say what?
Provided it could be accredited. You can do whatever you want. And I was like, wow. So it was a pretty exciting opportunity for me. I did know what I was doing, but I didn't know what I was doing. I will say that. I started off the first year on my own and developed 9 classes from a really holistic perspective. So what that meant was there was self-care was threaded throughout the curriculum and reflection was threaded throughout the curriculum. So even a class that you're like research, what does that have to do with, holism and all of that? Well, we can look at the holistic research. You could get into how you could research something from a holistic perspective, whether that's looking at modalities. And I think people too don't understand, like holistic is everything, right? So just because we're holistic nurses, we still would believe in surgery. We still believe in allopathic medications. But we also believe in, the power of doing your self-care and your healing and upregulating your endocannabinoid system and the stress response and how all these different modalities come into play there. Right. So, and actually I felt, so the first year I just developed all these classes. I developed a Reiki elective. It's still being taught, which thrills me to death, but it's a 3-credit upper level elective. Students get attuned to Reiki up to level 2. They practice Reiki on each other. They get to practice and reflect, on themselves and family members or colleagues, or if a patient allows it and their hospital allows it, all those kinds of things. Before the pandemic, we used to take them to the cancer center to get some practice in with doing Reiki, but it's also academic. So they're writing discussions, they're getting into the body of evidence, they're writing an evidence-based paper. And then I also went to a yoga teacher training, and I wanted to add in a yoga class that was just kind of like that. And I got pushback from the administration. The administration kind of changed on multiple levels during that year. And they said, well, we can run it as kind of a, seminar elective type of class. And it filled up and it kept filling up. And so finally they approved it. But that was when I wrote the psychoneuroimmunology article that I talked about earlier, because I felt like I needed to demonstrate that this is not just soft woo-woo fun stuff. That this is based in science. So that curriculum, and then I had a great partner that joined me, Dr. Lynn King, and we further developed the curriculum, went through the accreditation process. When the accreditors came, one of them said, when I looked at your curriculum, I thought, there's no way. There's no way they're really doing this. It looks too good. Students can't be grasping this information and actually.
Yeah.
And she said, when it solidified it for her was when she talked to the students about their experience
Right.
and that they were getting it. They
Yeah.
were changing their lives. They were recovering from burnout. Many of them, very interestingly, would leave their positions
Wow.
because they were looking for something different.
Yeah.
And that can be good. It can also not be good because we also need to be places to make changes, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
um, and just to see so many nurses also recover from burnout was really incredible.
Yeah.
I did leave there to go to Pacific College of Health and Science, which also has where I was director of nursing for a little while. And then sort of ironically realized that I needed to focus on my own self-care.
Yeah.
So after, years of leadership as president of ACNA and then taking on leadership of that program and getting it reaccredited, and also developing the medical cannabis certificate curriculum at Pacific College of Health and Science. So that curriculum, and I still do teach in that curriculum there. So I'm kind of like teaching there and at UMA now. I think it's going to be a nice little combination for me. And we're developing new medical cannabis curriculum there as well, hopefully to eventually offer a master's degree that will be in something like applied cannabis therapeutics. So you can look for that in the near future. But we mostly have nurses that go through the certificate program. There's a class called Endocannabinoid System and Pharmacology. And then there's a class called clinical applications or clinical guidelines of professional practice, something like that. And so you learn about the actual application of how do you use this in the clinical setting. And there's a capstone class where you kind of bring it all together, some case studies to look at, some practice with coaching and education, and then putting together some materials that can be shared. So we have had a couple hundred folks go through it at this point, and it's one of the most popular programs there.
Wow.
So people are really thirsty for that knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, I personally am just, having been in school in Boulder and which of course has a reputation, well-founded, but, just if I had had a little crystal ball to this moment and hearing about just the science and the evidence-based practice and the advanced practice, all the applications for this, it's incredible. It really is. And it's something that you hear anecdotally and it, from your own experiences, but then to actually see it come to fruition is I'm like, I got to call my, my whole college roommate who's now doing all kinds of cool therapeutic stuff herself. But it's really just incredible. And so timely, I think right now, as you spoke about, recognizing your need for your own self-care. Did you have any element of the whole nurses are the worst patients when it came to recognizing symptoms within yourself?
Oh yeah. It's kind of like, and we're subject to the larger culture too, right? So our culture really values working and overworking and giving it your all. And, there's kind of, there's kind of the subtext of, you got to have work-life balance, but is that possible? And the position that I was in, now there's 2 or 3 people doing that one position, right? So I was doing too much. For me, I will say that I was traveling a lot and when the pandemic started. So March 2020, I did get COVID after traveling. I'd been in New York City, Dallas, Texas, and Atlanta. So one of those places. At that time, we were saying it was still contact, right? So,
right.
Anyway, so I was pretty sick, and it was definitely kind of a scary thing because nobody really knew what to do. Couldn't get tested. There were really no good treatments, and everyone was saying, "Do not come to the hospital.
Unless you're
suffer home on your own." And then I had probably myocarditis afterward.
Wow.
But by the time that I got like the referral and everything,
Mhm.
and had the stress test, everything seemed fine.
Mhm.
And then of course
Mm.
everyone just says, "Oh, it's just anxiety," right? So I'm like, no, no, it's actually like
Right.
hurts.
Fast forward a year later, you're like
Right. Yeah, right. Um, so then, and then I had a concussion. So I love to
Oh,
ski.
jeez.
I had a very bizarre accident that my husband was skiing in front of me,
Oh,
and my younger daughter was behind me. And nobody saw me fall. They just saw me crumpled on the ground. I have no
oh, no.
memory. I have a blank spot for like 6 hours.
Oh,
Um,
Lord, yeah.
so I had to take time off to recover
Mhm.
from that and really started thinking like, what do I want to do and what am I doing and why am I doing
Mhm.
all of this? Um, and decided that I needed to figure out how to do something differently in my life, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like I've pretty well recovered from the concussion and pretty well recovered from the COVID, and I'm fully vaxxed and boosted and all that stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but I think what I'm recovering from now is like this idea of like workaholism almost, right?
Mm. Mhm.
And as I'm not working as much, I'm seeing space for like other areas that need healing in my life.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing so much suffering now with nursing. I do follow the nursing subreddit on Reddit, and it's like all about the trauma, and
Right.
at least that's what I see when I read through the postings,
Yeah.
and the
That's what
struggle
we
and
see on our
the
socials as well.
suffering. Yeah. Yeah. And so how are we, so there's kind of those bigger questions like, okay, I'm working on myself, other nurses might be working on ourselves. And then how do we get to the point where we take all this healing work we've done and then help to shift to change the profession?
Right.
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 And I feel like there are people doing things. There's I'm a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing, which is kind of like an offshoot of American Nurses Association. You have to get inducted into it. It's a lot of the nursing leaders out there.
Mhm.
And I feel like perhaps we haven't done enough from those kinds of levels to really
Yeah.
reach down into the actual practice level and
Yeah.
support the kind of change that we need as a profession. I
Right.
love, love, love that people are leaving their full-time positions and going out as contractors.
Yeah.
Um, in 2002 or three, I did some research with a group called the Nurse Manifest Project, and we read a bunch of nurses' stories, and then
Mm.
we were we were charged with kind of reflecting it back as a story. So
Mhm.
I wrote a story about kind of a futuristic sci-fi future of nursing where like patients are lined up, they're on these web beds, a lot of stuff is done by robotics, and there's just like
Mhm.
one nurse, patients are dying, they get taken off on a conveyor belt. I mean, it's pretty
Wow.
intense. And
Yeah.
then it turns out this was just a dream, and that the nurse wakes up and journals about her dream and then goes about being a holistic nurse during the day, but talks
Mhm.
about there are still hospitals and some nurses choose to work there, but they work there on a contracted basis. And it
Mhm.
was all from this great walk out of nurses.
Yeah.
So it's
Wow.
kind of for
That's
me a little,
uncanny.
it's kind of exciting to see it. I do think that with holistic nursing, there is a great place for robotics. To me, that's really, it's not what I'm going to study or do anything about, but it's super exciting to think how we could use robotics to do so many of those things that could,
Yeah.
in theory, free us up to really be that caring, healing presence,
Right.
which
Right.
is, besides the money, which it's usually not worth the money. Um,
Right.
it's why we're attracted to nursing, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think any nurses get into it saying, "I'm doing it for the paycheck." Like, and then when they
I
really
think some do, but what I think is that they generally don't last too long. They
Right, true, true, true.
right? They pull a good paycheck for a while, and then the trauma and everything that goes on in
Right.
nursing, you probably go, "This is not
When
worth
you
it."
really see the job, what the
Right,
job can be.
right. And
Yeah.
and that's a huge problem. We know that 30 to 50% of nurses, are new grads. they're out within a year or two.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and and that's been that way for years. And it's like, what are we doing about that?
Right.
I wrote about that in a nursing shortage article that you can find in Advances in Nursing Science. I wrote 2 different articles. One was about just our problems as a profession.
Mhm.
Published that in 2002. Then I did a follow-up in 2011
Mm.
and really looked at kind of the academic side and the issues within there and what needs
Yeah.
to change. And I could write those same articles today.
I was just gonna say, if you had to
Yeah.
write a 2021 edition, what do
I
you I mean, we
think,
have a lot of nursing students that follow,
oh, good.
our pages, and what do you think are the biggest things right now that they are up against,
Wow.
so that we
So
don't lose
nursing
them in.
students, thank you for coming and joining
Yeah.
this amazing profession. You're entering at a really challenging time for change and transformation. I think some of the things they're up against is, not getting enough clinical experience with the pandemic.
Mhm.
So that applied experience, and that can be really scary. I know that, a lot of folks are getting simulation, and the data makes simulation look like it's pretty good, but it's just not the same as interacting with a human being.
Mhm.
You're up against walking into very stressful environments, working with people that have PTSD and are burned out and are not
Mhm.
recognizing it, up against sort of like figuring out your own healing journey and what you want to do
Right.
about that and what you need to do so that you can, take care of yourself, so that you don't get sick, but also go in and help to change
Right.
systems. And just getting the experience, I think right now is really tough.
Yeah.
And hopefully not being in situations where there's lateral violence. And then it's becoming a dangerous workplace, right?
Mhm.
So nurses are facing violence from patients and their significant others. And in Canada, a couple years ago, they passed a law that was about first responders, and maybe the police and a few other groups that were protected against violence that they experienced, and people would be charged for crimes
Right.
against them, and nurses were not included.
Wow.
And so, that kind of tells you, like, either folks are not recognizing, or we've been oppressed for so long
Right.
that we're not recognized as
Right.
that important.
Yeah.
So we need to. And no one's going to stand up for us.
Yeah.
We've got to do it for ourselves.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
it's so important.
Yeah.
Well, lastly, one topic I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on, because we've
Uh-huh.
touched on it throughout our conversation, um, where you talk about holding a healing space for
Mhm.
patients. If we apply that same thought to nurses for each other, we at NurseDeck feel like connection is a curative process, and we want nurses to come together, because not having to explain something before you get into a space with someone where they just get it. And then it doesn't really matter what you talk about in that space, but being around people that completely understand what you're going through and can relate to that. Um, I love that you know so much of the science behind this and why that it is truly a healing experience for everybody involved. Can you speak a little bit about how communities like NurseDeck can help facilitate that?
Yeah, so that's a great thought, Brianna, and I think it's super exciting. One thing that I have learned across sort of my own healing journeys, then looking at the literature and the philosophy and all of that, is that we don't heal. I mean, we do heal alone, but we heal best in community.
Hmm.
And when others are there to witness, and when
Yeah.
we're able to release things, and when we recognize that we're not alone.
Yeah.
Being alone, loneliness, we know, is a quote killer. It's just as damaging to your body as smoking.
Yeah.
So we've got to figure out ways that we can connect, that we can share our common experiences, that we can find solutions for issues, and that we can listen and hear each other.
Yeah.
I think that's one reason why 12-step programs can help as well, because
Hmm.
there's so much sharing. in a space, and not always advice given, but
Mhm.
just sharing and knowing that there's a space that you can go to,
Mhm.
is super important as well.
Right.
And again, like, no one's going to do this for us. No one's going to
Right.
elevate the profession of nursing except for us. Uh,
Yes.
Medicine is not really interested in it. I mean, they want us to practice too, in theory. They've made public statements, like from the Institute of Medicine, that we should be practicing to the full extent of our license and all of that.
Mm.
But they're not really that interested in changing environments.
Right.
Um, and it's our practice, right? So
Yeah.
that's the other thing. It's like, that's nice, the Institute of Medicine is telling us things, but it's our
Right.
professional practice, and we need to take more control of it,
Yes.
and set our limits and boundaries, right?
Mhm.
Which is
Yeah.
hard to do when we come from traumatic backgrounds.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, so it's
And
kind of like
especially, I think, in the face of, any crisis is an accelerator, but having a global pandemic where we're all sort of in
yes,
this, like, pressure cooker, and we see the cracks that have been evident for decades in nursing,
right.
but having the empowerment to do something about it, with the support of our fellow nurses.
Yeah, and I think, as NurseDeck grows and evolves, are there ways to have things like advocacy training, and learning things about setting boundaries, and how do you communicate effectively, and how do
Right.
you affect change, and hopefully that's things that you all are thinking about too, to really become a hub of
Yeah.
one, healing, and then from that healing really stems the action and the ability to create change.
Right.
So,
Great. Well, I think that's a very positive way to end our conversation. I love that you've kind of sprinkled in all these different links, and we will go through and tease those out so people
oh,
can
great.
find all the articles that you have referred to. Um, we would love to see you on our NurseDeck social site. It's just
Awesome.
springing up now. We're just trying to bring together as many different voices as we can from the profession, and provide a space for the magic to happen. So,
Great.
yeah, I think that's all I have question wise. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about or have a message for anybody?
My message is just that, it's a challenging time right now. I want to wish us all as a profession some grace and some ease as we're on our healing journey, and that we can emerge from this stronger and healthier, and ready to create sort of a new era of nursing. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Dr. Carey Clark, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
time. I am thinking about all the beautiful fall leaves. I hopefully you still get to see out of your window.
They're falling to the ground, but
uh,
hopefully snow is next. So,
yes, yep. I'm down in Florida, so we get like a
oh,
little
you don't get
stray
snow.
red or orange leaf every once in a while and get excited about it.
Yeah.
But again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch when this starts. Kind of awesome. Well, thank you
Great.
so much. It was wonderful to meet you. I love all the
Yes.
work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you. Well, take good care.
All right. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.